Former Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel had some serious criticism for Democrats for putting too much focus on who's in what bathroom and locker room, and also letting education fall and crime rise. Here he was on Real Time with Bill Maher on Friday. Take a look.
We've gone through 5 years where people became way too permissive of the culture. They were all, which is why everything's locked up at Walgreens and CVS, and that is a disaster. Yeah. And our school, and I'll say this about our schools: I don't want to hear another word about the locker room. I don't want to hear another word about the bathroom. You better start focusing on the classroom.
I agree.
We had the worst reading scores for 8th graders in 30 years. And nobody, not a governor, not a mayor, not a president, not a secretary of education is talking about it. We're all wrapped up. Look, in 7th grade, if I known that I could have said the word they and got in the girls' bathroom, I would have done it. Okay, we literally are a superpower. We're facing off against China with 1.4 billion people, and 2/3 of our children can't read 8th grade level.
There was more where that came from.
What's really crazy about where the party's gone, it's taken an identity politics that the only way you have a moral standing is you're somehow been hurt. And that is insane. And if you want to take a moral standing of an identity politics based on where you've been hurt, then we're going to do it about the working and middle-class families of this country who's gotten the shaft over the last 30 years.
So these come at a time where the Democratic Party is obviously engaged in a lot of soul searching. I saw online that there was recently a meeting of Third Way Democrats, a kind of centrist organization that produced a report on what they think Democrats need to do to win voters. None of this is surprising. Their takeaway on why Democrats have a cultural disconnect with the working class is overemphasis on identity politics, faculty lounge problem of seeming judgmental, out of touch, and dismissive of non-elites, failure to prioritize economic concerns, weak messaging, fear of dissent within the party. That's kind of interesting. Candidates and operatives need to feel more comfortable just saying no to activist groups, attachment to unpopular institutions like the media, government bureaucracy, while being critical of things that working class people value, like churches, small business, and the police. So, this is all advice that I don't think the left and progressives would want Democratic Party to take necessarily, because it cuts against their policies, although what policies you want and what strategy is necessary to win office are not necessarily compatible things. Everybody likes to pretend that if you just did what I think is right, then you would be more popular. I'm actually under no illusions that that is the case.
Yeah, I mean, look, Rahm Emanuel is someone who I am skeptical of for reasons in his personal record. So we'll get into the bigger argument about identity politics in a second. When Rahm Emanuel was mayor, one of the things that hampered his popularity in Chicago, rightly, was that he fought for more than a year to keep dash cam footage of the murder of Laquan McDonald out of public view, and eventually had to air that footage only under a judge's order. And that is something that I don't think we should forget when he presents himself as one of these sort of wise men. He was also someone, to the point about centrism, who discouraged then President Obama from going forward with the bid to pass the Affordable Care Act. I understand that conservatives don't like that, but I think Democrats and liberals think of it as perhaps the key accomplishment of the Obama presidency, and Emanuel was against that. He's also personally wealthy because he's had a business career often in tandem or in revolving around his political career. Now, there is separately an argument about whether identity politics has consumed the Democratic Party too much. And that argument I am sympathetic to mostly, to a degree. I think that there's a problem, though, in that people tend to think of this as left or centre, just as these blanket terms. I would argue that in economic terms, one of the difficulties the Democratic Party has had recently is in not connecting with people's anger about economic stagnation, rising wealth inequality and things of that nature. That, I think, is an area where the Democratic Party could benefit from going more to the left, But on things like pronouns or bathrooms, there, though I don't like him personally, I take Emanuel's political point.
I think it's interesting, this idea that there's not enough dissent in the Democratic Party or in the inter-Democratic coalition, which I think there is some truth to, especially compared to the Republican Party, where there are vast ideological battles and differences being worked out. Now, there isn't a lot of debate over whether you like Trump or not. If you don't like Trump, you're outside the party. That issue's settled. But even some dissent and debate over how the Ukraine issue and Zelensky was handled, as we read when we discussed it. There were obviously many people siding with Trump and happy he did it, but also some not and speaking up. And then on on economic issues, there's pro-tariff, anti-tariff people. There's the immigration dispute between the Vivek Elon side and the Steve Bannon side. There are some vast policy differences that are being argued about in public. I mean, even what I discussed in my radar about how the Epstein files release was handled, that was Bannon and Jack Posobiec criticizing pretty strongly Pam Bondi for how she handled it. Right. So there's a lot of arguing and differences being worked out. I won't say there's no dissent on the Democratic side. Of course there's some dissent, and we hear people like Rahm Emanuel, Jared Golden, et cetera, speak up and say, I think Democrats are too pronoun obsessed. And then you have prominent dissenter people like John Fetterman, for instance, probably not dissenting in a direction you agree with, but dissenting nonetheless. But overall, it's not nearly as much as on the Republican side, I think.
Well, I don't know. I mean, even on the trans issue, which we've talked about a number of times here, Seth Moulton, I think, was the Democratic congressman who soon after the election was making a more, for want of a better term, centrist argument on that topic. And I do think you're seeing the old clash, which always happens between the third way types, the Bill Clinton types, and the left re-emerging. Certainly one of the more interesting things to me has been Bernie Sanders, whatever age he is now, becoming again a kind of prominent figure arguing for much more economically populist programs and so on and so forth. And to be fair to Sanders, leading the charge on why there should be a more robust defense of Ukraine in its war with Russia. So I think those dissenting voices are actually heard. And perhaps they have become a little more amplified following the defeat last November, when there's a need to reevaluate things.
Well, I do think dissenting media on the Democratic progressive left side has died off a little bit. I think I've talked about this on the show a couple times. It just becomes clearer and clearer with each passing day that, and I'm sorry this is the case for people who like progressive and leftist policies, but the media ecosystem, the very left media ecosystem that, frankly, this show was strongly a part of at one point under Crystal and Sagar, when Crystal was very, very, very pro-Bernie Sanders and delivered a lot of her personal monologues on the show about Bernie Sanders, and there were a lot of people tuning in to hear about and be excited about that, and the whole network of YouTube and internet and podcasting that was Joe Rogan himself, fan of Bernie Sanders. Right. Now a Trump person. I think there's been a lot of dying off in that space that is interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the more mainstream outlets have always been pretty hostile to that.
Oh, entirely hostile. And they're dying off at a slower rate, but they're struggling.
Right.
But whereas a lot of the really dissenting, though, contrarian left people I'm talking about have become, many of them have just outwardly become right-wing over time.
Yeah, I know, which is...
Some of them are in the Trump administration. Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr.
I know, that's a whole other story, which we will get into in some other debate, in some other segment.
All right, well, speak of the devil, and he shall appear. Joe Rogan and Elon Musk were looking back at CNN's coverage of the first assassination attempt, of then-candidate Donald Trump, and we're going to discuss what they said. Stay with us.